Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this YouTube live session on the YouTube channel of Fridays for Future India. I am Nayantara. I am a volunteer under the Fridays for Future India movement as a research volunteer. And today I am joined by Yuvan, who is my fellow volunteer and also a writer, naturalist, and social ecological activist. And today we're going to talk about something really important. And before that, let me just tell you a bit about, for those who are new to this channel, maybe to Fridays for Future. Fridays for Future India is basically the Indian chapter of the global youth-led movement Fridays for Future. And we are an inclusive, egalitarian movement. And our goal is to strive for better climate policy, climate action, and better safeguards for our environment, biodiversity, forests, and the people dependent on them. So today we're going to talk, as I said, about something really important that is going to affect all of these aspects that we strive to work towards. And this is something called the Draft EIA 2020. So I will get to exactly what that is in a minute. But before that, why are we here? Why are we talking about this? So the draft TIA 2020 notification was supposed to be translated into different languages so that everyone in the country can understand it properly and understand the implications of it. But this was not done. And for that reason, it's being delayed. And for that reason, we're here talking about the draft TI notification 2020 in different languages throughout this week. So we've done live sessions in Bengali, Assamese, Hindi, and some other languages. And we're also planning to do more such sessions in more languages. And so keep a lookout for these live sessions on our YouTube channel or Facebook. So today we're going to talk about it in English. And so let's start with what even is the EIA. So EIA is basically an environmental impact assessment, and that is a comprehensive process. It's a comprehensive review process that studies or assesses the effects of proposed projects or activities, the effect of these activities on the environment, biodiversity, natural resources, ecology, etc., before it is given an approval by the government. So the main purpose of an EIA is basically to include different perspectives and stakeholders in the process of approving any project, construction project, infrastructure project, so on, including the people who will be affected, as well as scientists and NGOs and even the general public. So this is done in order to look at the environmental impacts of a project and then determine its feasibility. So that is the EIA. Now, what is the EIA draft notification of 2020? So on March 23rd, 2020, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change of the Government of India issued a draft EIA notification, which is basically a notification that seeks to bring some changes to the existing EIA notification of 2006, or the existing set of rules and regulations. So it's basically a new document that talks about some definitions, rules and regulations, processes, categories, all of which are important in the EIA process. And this seeks to replace the existing rules and regulations and so on. So today we're basically going to talk about this in a little more detail, but also in simple language. So with that, I'd ask Yuvan, could you just tell us how did we come to the draft TI notification 2020? What has been the process and what has been the timeline, and why was it set up in the first place?
Yeah. So EIA is very much what you just described about in detail, and it seems rather commonsensical that we would include something like that um, in our policy making in while considering industrial projects and so on. It is basically an ethical thing, before getting into details and jargon. It basically means people have rights, nature has rights, rivers, mountains have rights. We have rights to clean air, clean water, and so on. And it also means that some parties with political power or financial power don't have the provision to bulldoze over forest land, river, and do what they want. So the EIA makes sure that enough care is taken. In theory, makes sure enough care is taken, considering the impact of any industrial project, making sure that the voices of people there are heard, and then a decision is taken whether to go ahead with a project or not. It's a very ethical thing. But that did not come about very organically. It seems that, yeah, people should have their rights to say their piece before being evicted from their land, or if their livelihood and forest is going to be destroyed. But it did not come about organically. The very first time even something of an inkling of an EIA came about was in 1977, when a Central Planning Commission said, for river valley projects, please study the impacts before you go build a dam. That's what they said. For all those years through independence, and of course before, we did not really practice this as a policy. And even the 1977 one was a piecemeal thing. It wasn't a policy as such, but as a law, it first came in 1994. Now, did it come suddenly up, people realizing that, okay, environment is important, people is important? Apparently not. That decade saw the biggest industrial disaster perhaps in India. The Bhopal gas tragedy happened, where a pesticide company, then called Dow Chemicals, there was a leak of lethal gas, methyl isocyanate, and that night over 8,000 people were killed and lakhs of people were injured for life, and there the aftermath of that is still seen today in Bhopal. And so that tumbled, and there were few other industrial disasters which happened, but this stood starkly in what do you call, outside of all that. And that led to, in some way, 1994 saying, hey, you're going to go do a project, you're going to set up a plant, you need to follow this process, you need to have regulations, you need to have compliance reports, you need to come and report to the government saying this is what, you need to check whether your machines work. All that came into place after having faced something as dark as that. And then 2006 came. Now that is a very mixed kind of an EIA. In 2006, the EIA was changed. Now, was it changed for good or bad? It's a gray area. Some of it was made clear. Some processes, like public hearing, was made transparent. There were other kinds of processes which were included. For instance, appraisal. A project is, the EIA is done by the project proponent, and the project proponent may do it badly because I want to push my project, and I might compromise that. So appraisal was made stringent, so people look into it and say if it's done well and whether. But there were other things which were diluted in 2006 as well. One of it was construction projects and other kinds of projects. They were moved into not requiring public hearing. And the area for construction project was 20,000 square meters, and that is about 200 million hectares. It's a huge amount of land. It was moved into not requiring public hearing at all. Of course, that was been further diluted in all forms in EIA 2020. Now, EIA 2020 stands strangely away from all the previous notifications. The previous notification had some good points. This has none. So yeah, we'll talk about that. But before that, I thought I'll ask you, as a student of philosophy, from an ethical point of view and from a people's rights, environmental rights point of view, what does
Hmm.
the EIA 2020 envision, and
Hmm.
what does it violate?
Hmm.
What of course legally we can speak, but from a point of ethics, what do you think?
Yeah.
How that plays out?
Yeah, so I mean, to talk about this in terms of what does an EIA stand, like an EIA, an ideal EIA stand for, and what are the foundations of that EIA, and then we can actually connect that to how all of these are being diluted. So I think first and foremost is that the EIA must give the ideally it gives a much needed consideration to environmental concerns and the protection of India's rich biodiversity and ecosystems. So that's the first and foremost, which, as we will see, it sort of again dilutes because it takes a step back and does exactly the opposite. And what it aims to do ultimately is reduce that protection, and reduce that consideration. Secondly, it does so, or secondly, the EIA is supposed the aim the what it aims to do is this entire process must be followed in a scientific manner with the scrutiny of experts in environmental science and conservation, like you were just saying, right? And um, most importantly, it democratizes the entire process of establishing any industry, because uh, due due consideration is given, or must ideally be given to all the stakeholders, from people affected to like the scientific community, general public, and so on. So again, we will see how even this is completely diluted. uh, it's not at all a democratic process that this new procedure will follow. And then another major value in an ideal EIA process is the decentralization of power and decision making. So in the whole process, it shouldn't be that the only people involved are the project proponent and the ministry itself. So you can't have a mechanism where the only two parties involved are the actual person who's trying to make the industry and the ultimate environmental clearance body. So you have to involve so many people, including the people who will be affected, people who will know about that region, experts, and so on. So it has to be decentralized, and there has to be power given to people at all levels. And again, that also is diluted. And finally, I think one of the major roots of an EIA process is something that many of us know as the precautionary principle. So, which says that precautionary measures must be, put in place when there is a potential harm to the environment, or some project can potentially damage the environment. So there are these particular rules in under this, which actually does exactly the opposite. It violates the precautionary principle, where due consideration is not given to precautionary measures. So I think these are like the major like aspects of how this new draft notification will completely disturb these basic principles and values that an EI is ideally supposed to be founded in. So I mean, having said that, okay, I talked a lot about ideal EIA, but are is the EIA process currently, without the draft notification, really the ideal process? Is it being followed, and how is that?
Okay. Um, okay. So just to look at some stages of an EIA process, it's all, there may be a lot of strange words in it, but it's all very commonsensical. You when you're proposing a project, you have to understand what kind of a category it falls in. Is it hazardous? Is it bad? Is it just a minor thing? So that's called screening. And then so on, there's scoping, and then baseline data, public hearing, and then whether environmental clearance is given or not, and so on. So all these processes, basically you make a project, you go first study its impact, you go and find out who are the people living there, what kind of life is found there, what are its functions, and what it hosts. And after studying that, you go and tell the people, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Do I have your, what do you people think about it? And the people's opinions are registered and taken into account. And then this whole study and all of this given to an expert committee to make sure that it's done well, and whether this can go ahead or not based on all this study. And then there is if the project goes ahead or not. But this has not been the case. Most EIAs are done very badly. And one of the reasons for that is the EIA, although it's a very important thing, it's perhaps very central to both people's democracy and environmental democracy. It's a notification, which means a very weak law. Now, let's take the CAA, for instance, Citizenship Amendment Bill. Now, that's a very draconian law. It's a overt way of exclusion, as a lot of us within FFF have been part of that campaign. That is a bill. No, bill has to be passed in Parliament. The rules in a bill have far more legal power. The EIA is just a notification. And one of the things we are also trying to push, of various kinds of people, experts, movements throughout India, trying to push that you make it an amendment, so that it's given far more value. And if there are violations, the consequences are far stronger. And when something is an amendment, you cannot change it. So if the next government comes and say, oh, mining area is very less, I want to increase it, they can go meddle with it and change it and do a little public review, eyewash, and then bring it back. So a notification is very amenable to that. So if it can be made into a stronger law. Yeah. But let's look at some of the ways in which EIAs have been done very badly. For instance, let's take the Dibang Valley issue, for instance. The EIA done there. Now, Dibang Valley is known for its man-tiger relationship, perhaps the only example of that in the world's forests of the local communities, the Idu Mishmi, having this strange, mysterious understanding with the tigers there. The EIA said there are no tigers there. The issue there is, if you bring in the tiger into your EIA, tiger is a very protected animal. It's called the Schedule 1 species. It has extraordinary legal protection. You bring that in, then you probably can't build your road, you can't build your dam, and so on. Similarly, in Vedandangal, currently, where illegally there are pharmaceutical companies, EIA left out all the migratory birds, all the near threatened and threatened species, because they are protected again. And they had a EIA which said crow, sparrow, pigeon, and babbler, and so on. So, and they are able to get away with that. And one of the reasons is because EIA by itself is a weak law. So, yes.
Yeah, and I think what this really tells us is that we need improvement in the process so that it really stands for the foundations that it was built on. And that is, democratizing people's views and environmental considerations. So what we need is more of that, more consideration given to things like getting translations of the EI report so that everyone can understand things like you said, more accurate scientific accuracy in the very report. And while this should be the case of this is how the ministry should try to bring in amendments or notifications to change it, to improve it. And what is happening in reality is the exact opposite. They are taking a step back. They're making it easier for these examples to happen even more. So and now let's see exactly how they do that. And can we start by talking about the legality of it? Like, is it even legal, and is it following legal guidelines, constitutional principles, other laws? What is your view on
that? So firstly, the campaign against draft EIA 2020 has become huge. There are judiciary, state governments, youth movements, local communities, lawyers. There are millions of people fighting against the EIA. Now, how does it violate? What does it violate? If we go into the draft and kind of weave it around ourselves, we'll find some 3 dozen things which are glaring at your face. But let's look at word go. Where does the EIA draw its power? What is the parent law? It's something called the Environmental Protection Act. And the act does exactly what it it claims to do. It lays down various guidelines and rules to follow to protect environment and people of it. So EIA specifically draws its power from something called Section 3 of the Environmental Protection Act. Now, any law can do two things. One, it can give powers to the government to enforce it better, government or any kind of authority, pollution control board, forest department, so on, or even people. Other is it can put down rules. So you shall do this, you shan't do that, sort of a thing. Now, Section 3, the first statement and everything which follows, what it says is that this law gives the central government all the powers necessary to take measures it deems necessary to protect and improve the quality of the environment. Now, that is how it starts. Now, that is why if you download the draft EIA 2020 and read the first paragraph, it says, whereas so on and so forth, I'm drawing my power from Section 3 of the Environment Protection Act. And what does that say? It says you have powers to do everything necessary to protect and improve the quality of the environment. The present EIA does nothing. In fact, it goes 100 steps against that and completely unprotects it and legalizes violations and so on and so forth. We can go into that later. But at the word go, it's illegal. So the law tells you something and you do something else, it's unlawful. That is one thing. That's with the EIA itself. The other is in the process of the EIA and how it's being kind of brought about right now. And we are seeing, firstly, it was brought about in the pandemic, where everybody is completely doing something else. Maybe take that up separately. But there's something called a pre-legislative consultation policy. Now let's kind of unpack that. What that means is that the Constitution says laws are for the people and by the people. Yeah, any kind of law. It's for the protection of people's rights and other kinds of rights. And it is by the people. So it's important when you make a law is to get people's opinion. And it has to be done in various ways. One of the things this policy in 2014 clearly and compulsorily made for any kind of law is that you have to make it available to all the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders for the EIA draft 2020? Everybody. Everybody will be affected. You will have to provide a simple form. The government has to make a simple explanatory note in all languages for everybody to understand, and so on and so forth. There are about 14 points which have to be followed for any kind of law you bring about, and none of them were followed, and they tried to capitalize on this situation. So it is illegal in that sense as well. And moreover, there are a whole lot of laws which protect indigenous rights, local community rights, people's rights, environmental rights, and so on. The EIA, what it does, it creates a large loophole. So you can have violations, constitutional violations, other kinds of legal violations. I say, hey, EIA, I followed that, and then you can get out. That's one kind of a very a dangerous loophole it creates for all kinds of transgressions which could happen against people, against environment, and so on. So maybe you can talk about a couple of specific examples going into the EIA and what are some clauses in it which are glaring, and maybe explain it simply.
So one thing that the draft EIA notification 2020 does is that it legitimizes projects that have started operating or construction without proper environmental clearance. And this is done through something called the post-facto approval. So in very simple words, it would mean that projects which have started functioning illegally will be considered by the expert appraisal committee and could be allowed to continue operating with and if at all they could be given some penalties, and even these penalties are ranging from a meager 1,000 rupees to 10,000 rupees per day of violation, depending on the category of the project. So basically they can get away with actually start functioning illegally. And get away with it without, they may also get away with it without any penalty. So what does this do? First of all, it violates, like we had spoken about the precautionary principle. So this completely violates the precautionary principle, which says that due precautions must be given before uh, any potentially damaging activity or project can come up. And this does exactly the opposite of that. It allows the precautionary principle to be diluted and not followed at all. And secondly, if we talk about the penalty is completely disproportional to the potential impact of the project. So and that to the illegally functioning project. So this project can have it can have such great impact on the environment and biodiversity. So basically, you can start a project that lies very close to a wildlife sanctuary, or even inside, and in most cases it will, harm the uh, ecosystem of the area, and even affect entire species or natural resources, and even people living in that area. And all of this can be done illegally. And in spite of this, the project will be considered before the committee, and even after the even after not getting proper clearance, and after getting considered, they can still get clearance. And even if it doesn't get the clearance, the damage has already been done. So there's no point of this entire clause at all. And I'm not even giving some kind of hypothetical example. Like, so I'll just give you an example of something that happened very recently in Assam, where a plant in Oil India Limited was functioning. A plant by Oil India Limited was functioning without proper permissions and clearance, and it caused an oil spill. Uh, which led to a lot of fatalities, human and non-human. And this was close to the Dibru Saikhowa National Park. And ultimately, there was a huge fire that was, caused by this oil spill. In fact, multiple fires, and this displaced a lot of locals, and as I said, caused a lot of deaths. So this will become the new normal if we allow such a thing, such a process where these industries can just simply start working, and then just wait, try to get clearance later at some point. And this will sort of become a trend where everyone, because look at it from the point of view or the perspective of the project proponent. So clearance process takes a lot of time, and rightly so. And that could lead to a lot of delay and some kinds of different kinds of constraints for them. So the option of starting this sort of construction and then being appraised by a committee is like an easier option. But then the damage will already be done. So this is really, really problematic for the reasons that I've stated. And there are many more really multiple implications that will happen when this interacts with other such problems within the draft. So and one of these is the problem of where it exempts a lot of projects from being in the public consultation process, and being in so many different categories. So can you talk about those, Yuvan?
Yeah. So, yeah, moving on from post-facto, which is seen as a kind of a very glaring thing. You allow for something to happen and the government says, oh, fine, it seems like you've been running well, go ahead.
Yeah.
So the other big flag point which the present EIA has received is that a lot of so-called red category industries have been moved into a classification called B2. Now, what do all the B2? Now, if you take the draft and you go through from page 35 to 47, you'll see these different categories: A, B1, and B2. B2 requires no EIA process. If somebody suggests it, it goes to the regulatory authority, and then either gets appraised or not, and then you get a clearance. There is no public involved. There is no going and studying the place, nothing. Now, these B2 usually have slightly minor projects. Earlier itself, they had some dangerous projects, but right now there's been a huge movement of red category projects. Now, what are red category projects? These are industries which are termed in terms of the highest hazard they pose to environment and people. Now, what that means is coal and non-coal mines, petroleum, uh, dyeing units, um, and small dams, and various others. So they've been moved out of public consultation, and that raises a huge red flag. Um, and the other thing, the other kind of exemption which has been made for this so-called B2 category is that they, even if you put it in a wildlife sanctuary or a national park, there is no, they are exempted. Uh, they don't need a kind of, it can be in a rainforest, it could be in an extremely biodiverse zone. But if it's a so-called B2 category, they don't need the kind of scrutiny they get for other kinds of, you know, projects. So that is one thing. Now, the greatest windfall, of course, as always, has come for this construction, field. Now, 200 million hectares was huge. They already are in B2 category. They don't require. That has been made into 500 million hectares. 550,000 square meters is about 500 million hectares. And that's the size of about 4 to 6 mega malls. And that sounds like, one of these, mega sales these malls leave,
Yeah,
they come and buy
like a
everything
huge
at low.
airport, maybe.
Ah.
Hmm.
No, so the EIA is very reminiscent of, this a sale which a shop does, hey, come and buy anything you want at a low cost kind of a thing. So, yeah, so it's like that. And yeah, so, and other things to add on to that, a lot of environmental clearance validities have been increased. Mining projects, you have to periodically go and get environmental clearance at different stages because the nature of places and their complex interactions with public, with the state of the project keep transitioning. And so to get environmental clearances periodically is important. So that has been increased. So mining projects from 30 years to 50 years. Nuclear power plants from 5 years to 15 years. So that's like inviting disaster and so on and so forth. The important thing about all these projects, so in the B2, there are 44 projects. And in a separate category, which don't require a environmental clearance at all, which means you just kind of get permission from an authority and go ahead. There's another 40 different projects, and all these don't include the participation of public in any manner, though they will be direly harmed, evicted,
Yeah.
uh, land grabbed, and so on. So could you talk about that, the public consultation?
Yeah. So I mean, as you were saying in the beginning of the session, the process. So EIA report has to go through a public consultation process before it goes to the appraisal committee, or before the decision is finalized and they're given clearance. So this is so that people who will potentially be affected by the project or other stakeholders can review the report and discuss it with the project proponent, along with suggestions, changes, objections, and so on, which the project proponent has to take into account before preparing the final report, which goes to the appraisal committee. And this is done through submitting suggestions, public hearing, and so on. So what does this notification do? Now, according to the existing legal guidelines, the time that the public or different stakeholders have to respond to this by giving their suggestions is a minimum period of 30 days. So basically, the project proponent has to give at least 30 days for people to respond to the EIA report. Now, according to this notification, this minimum period gets reduced to 20 days. And the entire public consultation process, the period for that gets reduced from 45 days to just 40 days. So now we need to think about this and what this implies. There are so many projects that are going to affect a large number of people, especially from rural or indigenous communities. They have to first read the report, maybe get it translated, understand each and every clause and points and what they mean for them, how it will affect them. They have to speak to all the members of the community about it, and then together compile a list of suggestions which will then go to the project proponent through a public hearing. So it is a very long and important process. My question is, how can this be done in 20 days? 20 days is just a little more than 2 weeks. Now, this entire process already, as you know, we were saying, they don't provide translations. They provide just a summary to them of the EI report. How can all this level of understanding, which is of something that is going to affect their lives, how can this entire thing be done in just 20 days? 20 days. And also, speaking of public hearing, uh, according to the notification, there is no quorum that is required to start a public hearing. So you don't need a specific number of people who need to be present in order to uh, like have a public hearing about the project. And this is only talking about projects that do follow a public consultation process. So as you said, there's a huge list of projects according to this notification which will not even require a consultation process, so public consultation. So this, as you said, includes chemical factories, construction projects, building projects, flyovers, petroleum industries. So huge list. And like there are more than 40 such types of projects which will not even go into to the public to review. And I don't know what kind of logic that follows, that supposedly that chemical fertilizer industries have absolutely no impact or don't cause any displacement or affect people's livelihoods. It sort of follows that assumption, which is completely inaccurate and wrong. And then there are projects concerning strategic issues which will be kept totally away from the public view. So there'll be no information about these projects that will come, let alone giving objections or suggestions for it. So this whole thing, we were talking about the principles. Imagine how many principles that violates, takes away that democratic process, takes away the right of the people to talk about how this is going to affect them and possibly speak out against it. And there's one more really problematic thing when we're talking in terms of involving the public, and that is in the case of violation. So whenever any project proponent makes a violation that is does not follow the proper guidelines according to the environment clearance given, that those violations cannot be reported by the public. So the public, suppose an environmental NGO cannot, if they notice that okay, someone is doing something wrong and this is causing environmental damage, they can't approach the ministry and say, look, this is happening, they are violating these rules. So guess who reports these violations? So according to this notification, these violations have to be self-reported. And that is basically only the project proponent can report these violations to the ministry. So basically, it's like saying that someone comes up, like builds a mine and says, oh no, my mine is causing environmental damage, let me just report it to the ministry so that they do something about it. So it's very illogical, and I think this is the most outrageous part of concerning the public consultation, which is completely illogical. So yeah, so these were some of the things that really affect this democratic process. But it's not only the general public that it sort of takes away power from or takes away the role of. It also reduces the role of different authorities like state governments and other authorities involved in environmental issues. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I just thought of a thief, stealing something and then going and saying, going to the police and say, hey, I stole it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to happen. Okay, so I mean, just to talk about role of states, something central to our democracy is called cooperative federalism. A large word, but what it means is that powers and functionings of both center and state are balanced in our country, so that neither one takes over the other, and then the voice of people is equally represented. So in any kind of process, both of them have a say. Now, a violation of that was the recent coal auctions. Now, all these coal blocks were auctioned to private companies, across India, and a lot of these were in state forests. State forests, reserve forests, village forests, protected forests, and so on. All these fall under the complete power of state governments, panchayats, gram sabhas, and so on. Only they have the power to divert it to anything else, whether they want to include more area into it, whether they want to divert it for a road, a mine, or whatever. Uh, when the Honorable Prime Minister announced this, the chief ministers, the Jharkhand chief minister, hey, it's our power, man. How can you do this? And then he refused it. And then the Maharashtra court said, this is not your power. What are you even trying to do? Sorry, we're not having these coal auctions. So that's a very important thing. The state, having understood its landscape, its people, gets to have a say on these things. So far, all these projects, and the authority which will regulate and look at these projects, something called the State Expert Appraisal Committee, and that will be formed by the state. Now, in the new EIA draft, this is being formed completely by the central government. So the central government completely decides who's going to do the project, who's going to appraise it, who's going to give the clearance, everything. This completely dismantles the state's role in all of this. And that is another red flag to our democracy. And if I may add on to that, some of the definitions. Now, some people, give a good, very few, give a good opinion about the present EIA draft, saying it streamlines certain things. It makes things clear, but it makes things clear for, to seamlessly kind of ease business for industries. It does not make it clear for environment. No, where environment and people are considered, makes things very hazy. For instance, you spoke about public hearing, and the way it defines public hearing, it firstly gives a definition of some kind of process where people are able to express themselves. And then if you go and look at the annexure, it says no quorum is needed. So you can, have this big, talk, and there'll be one person from the village sitting there, and you can say we conducted a public hearing. You can do something like that and get away with it. A violation, like you were saying, given some conditions and rules to follow if you're running a project, and if you don't follow that, you, instead of putting 2 tons of mercury into a lake, you put 500 tons. That's not considered a violation. Non-compliance is not considered a violation. And that's given. So if you end up doing that, I have to go somewhere, hey, I put, poison in the lake. I have to go report this. And, several other examples. For instance, for eco-sensitive zones, how it defines only centrally protected areas, wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. Those themselves have been exempted for various projects. But it leaves out of its definition of protected areas all state protected areas, like reserve forests, community reserves, conservation reserve. These are all fall into the state, equally important from a conservation point of view, from a local community and ecological point of view. Half of India's forests are reserve forests. From a conservation point of view, reserve forests are the most important kind of forest because of their sheer area. Now, they've been left out of the definition of eco-sensitive zones. So those are more examples of how environment is being dismantled, especially at a time of climate change, and various other countries are taking stringent measures to protect, reduce their carbon footprint, and so on. And we are in a pandemic, and this is the time when all this is being brought about. So how did the pandemic come about, and this coming during this strange time? How do you see that?
And before I go into that, I'd just like to mention to the people who are watching that we just discussed a few of the problems in the draft EIA notification. This is not an exhaustive list. So I'd encourage you to read it and read up on different articles that talk about this in detail. We just touched upon some of the major problems with it. So I'd just like to put it out there. And yeah, coming to, what you just said, the fact that we are in a pandemic, and this points to this is like, this may not be in the a problem within the draft AI notification. There are a lot of other problems in the way it was brought about, and the entire context of the entire issue. And the main point that I'd like to bring up here is that we are in a pandemic, right? We are in a global pandemic. And where, so this came out, this draft notification 2020, as I said, came out in March 23rd, and it was released in the Gazette on April 11th. And this was a time when the government was just putting in place these safety measures to tackle the pandemic, and people were just getting used to what's happening and understanding the impact of this pandemic and how it will affect them. And this is when they decided to release this notification, which is undoubtedly going to affect a large population, ultimately, if it becomes a from a draft notification to an actual notification. So what's really problematic here is that there are these crossroads in terms of the people who will be affected by this notification, and the people who would be having an especially hard time trying to adjust to this pandemic. And this includes indigenous communities, rural communities, people from not so privileged backgrounds. And these are the people who would be affected by the EIA draft notification and would require to actually understand it, read it, and be able to respond to it, talking about how this would affect them. And it is also these people who would be the most affected by the pandemic, whether it's in terms of employment or security and safety and so on. So what is this? It seems very cruel to think that they did something like this during a pandemic, in the middle of a pandemic. And then, as you said, why is this pandemic even happening? I mean, scientists have clearly shown this relationship, direct relationship between deforestation, lack of regard for environmental concerns, and such global pandemics and diseases spreading from rapidly from populations. So there is a clear link. And what does this draft notification do? It 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 exactly does that. It violates this entire concept of protecting the environment. And so it's ironical. I mean, it just shows that, again, one more thing was that there were no translations. As we started this entire webinar with that in mind, there were no translations provided for people to even understand what is happening. So all of this sends the message that basically we don't want you to know about this. We want to just get this done in hidden from the public view, and we want to just I don't know, they call it the ease of doing business. So I mean, that's what they are aiming for, without really looking for people's views. Even though they supposedly said that, oh, we are inviting suggestions and objections. And so, I mean, related to this is something that happened very recently with Fridays for Future India and with a couple of other movements, which, so Yuvan, could you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So before one pandemic is over, we've come up with a 83-page draft for another pandemic. So, yeah. So a lot of people have been campaigning for this, and it's something the government did not expect. They wanted to have it in Hindi and English, and it was hoped that not many people would read it and it would be passed, and then the land and nature and people could be sold off to private businesses. But it was not the case. All walks of people have been campaigning for this and continue to do so. And youth movements like Fridays for Future India, other movements like Let India Breathe and Extinction Rebellion and so on have been not just campaigning, but firstly creating awareness about it for all sections of society, whether it be translation, whether it be explanation, unpacking, simplifying what is there in the legal jargon of this draft. And moreover, empowering people to send in their public review. A public review is a due legal process. It's a right, and it has been stated in the draft itself that public review will be open for so long, and it was pushed twice. First, the public review ended during the pandemic itself, and I'm trying to get hospitalized and checking whether I'm sick or not. The public review was getting over, and then we campaigned and pushed it, and we'll talk about that also. So in that whole movement, we were empowering people to send in their objections, talking about how the draft is anti-people, anti-environment, telling them the various clauses, what is in it, and send in for them to be able to respond to it from informed place. And so we gave an email body, which people by their own will understood and replicated and sent to the minister and the MOFCC and the website given for the EIA. And a lot of people did that. Tens of thousands of people did that. And that is necessarily a good thing in a democratic country. If 6 billion people want to participate, there is space in a democratic country to participate. But we were booked for terrorism. UAPA, it's an anti-terrorism act under Section 18, which is for conspiracy and spreading religious hatred. I mean, it has no legal founding. We were booked for that, and it was alarming. Something like Fridays for Future, and most of the volunteers are between ages 12 and 25. It's young people, and there are about 10,000 people working on various things, right, from beach cleanups to tree planting or campaigns like this. Call us, book us under terrorism. It was alarming and shocking. Of course, it was withdrawn later, and then we were sent a notice under a different section, which again did not have a base, and our website was blocked, and then we campaigned for it, and it was given back again. So that was very strange to call public participation, to label dissent as terrorism. So what does that reflect of the values of the decision makers?
And they're doing this to a movement, like you said, which is youth led. I mean, it's bizarre to think that they could file as I don't know, as a volunteer. It's really scary to think that this actually happened. And I'm sure that a lot of our fellow volunteers also felt so, and even some of the younger volunteers. So it's really again, it sends out the message that even a movement, like, it's not even something like an organization or a registered body. It's a movement which people are driving for their own passion. And to sort of censor such a movement which is positive, inclusive, and trying to make a good point about something, it's really I sense a really bad message to everyone. And so
I just want to highlight that it is our right to send our grievances to public servants, to people who are elected. It is a constitutional right to their official email IDs, and that's what we did. To the said email ID and to the the people who are part of this decision making, to send our objections, grievances, concerns to a public servant is a constitutional right. And if you call that a violation, leave alone an act of terrorism, that is an act of, I don't want to call it, that is a violation.
Yeah. And Yuvan, there was an update into this entire issue yesterday. Could you tell us what happened?
Yeah. So the EIA draft was not widely given publicity to all the stakeholders. Now, who are the stakeholders? Everybody is literally the stakeholder in
Yes.
India, because something like this will affect entire populations, because this is the time of urbanization.
Mm.
So it was not made in all the 22 languages prescribed in the constitution.
Mm.
So various people took that up. Campaigns were going on. The Delhi High Court took that up. The Karnataka High Court took that up. And yesterday, a very positive move happened. What happened was that the Karnataka High Court put a stay on the last date for publication. So August 11th was the last date for public review, after
Yeah.
which, in theory, they would include the public, feedback, and then publish the final draft of the notification.
Mm.
They put a stay on that, and they said till September 7th you won't publish it.
Mm.
Secondly, we are recommending a 1 month extension of the public hearing period after you get it published in these languages. They've recommended it, but the center has said that they'll take a couple of days to decide the extension period and get back. So
Mm.
that's a very positive move, and
Mm.
I think to give that campaign that kind of a time, especially
Yeah.
after giving it multilingual publicity, perhaps there's a huge chance that such a dangerous notification will be withdrawn, and that
Yeah.
is seeing repercussions. Today, the Chennai High Court sent a notice to the central government saying, hey, you have not published it in all these languages, and somebody had filed a case and they sent it. And hopefully all other states. Now,
Yeah.
the Karnataka High Court has asked for Kannada. It is within their jurisdiction to ask for Kannada. Hopefully, various other
Yeah.
states, all walks of people will push for it, and
Mm.
ask for this, and contribute equally to this campaign.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. But still, all of these, even though this is it's a good news for the campaign as a whole, it still must not distract us from the fact that our ultimate goal is to get this withdrawn. So, I mean, this is like a primary demand as the Fridays for Future India movement, every single person who's campaigning against this, the primary goal or demand that we have is, first of all, withdraw the draft EIA. Because as you said, it was an entire package of inaccuracies and sort of violations, and yeah. So so it has to be withdrawn. It cannot be just improved. There's no scope for improvement. It has to be withdrawn. And if there has to be another notification, and see, here is where the second goal comes. The EIA notification must be released so as to improve the existing EIA process. So, like, we talked about a lot of those things, like translations and increasing period of time for public hearing, and all of these things, like
Following the
making,
law.
yeah,
Following the law.
exactly,
So the law
exactly,
says protect and improve the quality of the environment. The EIA should do that to a greater extent because of the times in which we live in, which is climate
yeah,
crisis.
yeah,
So
exactly. So so that should be followed. So EIA process must be improved, and this must be done. First of all, we are in a pandemic. Let this pass, please. And when this is done, it has to follow due procedure, and it has to be done in a democratic way, not the way, certainly not the way that was done this time. And so, yes, basically that is our primary demand: withdraw the EIA draft EIA 2020. And this is what I would like to leave all the viewers with. Please, you still have time to send your objections to the MOEFCC, and just putting it out there, they asked for it. It's part of the process. You are asked to send in your suggestions and objections. So you have listened to us, and I encouraged you to read up more about this. And you can write a mail to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change at moefcc@gov.in. And yeah,
the email ID given for the EIA.
yeah,
EIA
yes.
2020.
EIA 2020 hyphen moefcc@gov.in. You'll find this information online. You can look it up. There are a lot of resources where you can even find a draft email, which you can sort of take in some good points from there and send in your email. And of course, there is social media. So talk about it on social media. It's a great tool. We've had Twitter storms that have been successful at actually making substantial changes. So look for the hashtags, hashtag scrap EIA draft 2020, hashtag withdraw EIA 2020, hashtag no EIA dilution, and save EIA. So all of these hashtags, you'll find a lot of information on social media, which even you can talk about, share, and even create your art. I mean, this is something that has been happening a lot these days, where people have been creating beautiful art to speak out against very damaging projects. So there's so many ways through which you can contribute. And then of course, if anything, you can always look up our page, Fridays for Future India, on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, where you can watch videos. Again, reminding you that we are doing this session in different languages throughout this week. So you can check out the entire list and see which language you are most comfortable in understanding these things. And please watch those videos and share it across. Talk to your family about this. Talk to your friends about this. And if anything, you can also contact us through our social media, or send an email at fridaysforfuture.india@gmail.com. So these are, this is a long list of resources. You have a lot of resources. You have a lot of channels to take to actually do something and speak out. And we hope that this video sort of would compel you to do that in some way. And so thank you very much for joining us. And as I said, we hope that this was informative and also easy to understand. Uh, and yeah, so
So just want would you like to add that there are going to be live sessions
yeah,
throughout this week?
yeah. So as I said, this is not complete yet. The entire week we're going to have live sessions in different languages. So keep a lookout for these videos. You can follow us on our social media, but we've also put out a schedule. So you can check that out and see which, when you can log into YouTube or Facebook.
And
So
which language you prefer to understand it in? So we are trying to cover as many Indian languages as possible.
Yeah, because they didn't do their job. So I mean, we're doing their job for them, as always. So on that note, we'll take your leave. Thank you very much for joining us today, and bye bye.